the highway that cuts through the California desert toward the Coachella Valley, a road that usually carries weekend tourists, snowbirds, and the occasional tour bus began filling up before dawn. But this wasn't the usual traffic. The cars had flags hanging from windows. Philippine flags. Blue, red, white, gold, the sun and stars of an archipelago, 7,000 miles away, streaming through the dry desert air at 65 miles an hour. By the time the Indian Wells Tennis Garden opened its gates, the queue stretched further than any volunteer or security coordinator had planned for. People had driven from Los Angeles, from San Diego, from the Bay Area. Some had flown in from further, and every single one of them was there for the same reason. Inside the grounds, a tournament operations manager who has been working this event for over a decade said he stood at the entrance that morning and genuinely did not recognize the atmosphere he was walking into. The demographic, the noise, the energy, it was unlike any Indian Wells he had worked before. That is not an overstatement, that is what actually happened. And if you want to understand why, we need to start at the beginning, not just of this tournament, but of the story that made this moment possible. Before we talk about what's changing here, let's be precise about what this tournament has always been. Indian Wells, officially the BNP Paribas Open, holds a particular distinction in professional tennis. It's the only event outside the 4 Grand Slams to earn the informal designation the 5th Slam. That title isn't marketing, it's earned. The prize money rivals the majors. The fields are virtually complete. Every top 10 player in the world shows up in the California desert in March. The Stadium 1 at the Indian Wells Tennis Garden, seats just under 17,000 people and has hosted some of the most significant matches in the modern era of the sport. The crowd that typically fills it is by long tradition a specific kind of tennis crowd. Knowledgeable, quiet in the way that signals a deep familiarity with the sport's rhythms. Politely enthusiastic, the kind of audience that appreciates a well-constructed rally the way a museum visitor appreciates a particular brushstroke, with genuine understanding rather than raw emotion. That is the tradition. That is what Indian Wells has always been. What it became when the gates opened for Alexandra Eala's matches this week is something that has no precedent at this tournament. Possibly no precedent in American professional tennis. Here is what the numbers tell you, and then we'll talk about what the numbers miss. The Filipino-American population in Southern California is one of the largest and most established diaspora communities in the United States. The greater Los Angeles metropolitan area alone is home to well over 300,000 Filipino-Americans, with significant communities extending through the Inland Empire, which begins less than an hour from the Indian Wells Tennis Garden, and deep into San Diego County to the south and the Bay Area to the north. This is not a community that needed to travel far. Many of them were, in the most literal sense, practically already here. What changed this week is that they came all at once in numbers that the tournament's ticketing infrastructure handled, but only just. Reports from secondary market trackers showed ticket prices for Eala's matches moving in the days before the event in patterns that more closely resembled major boxing events or international football matches than professional tennis. The demand was real, it was organized, and it was driven by something that goes significantly deeper than sports fandom. But the numbers, the traffic reports, the ticket metrics, the merchandise sellouts, those things don't actually show you what it felt like to walk through the gates. What you would have encountered if you'd been there was a stadium in the process of becoming something new. The vendor lines were longer than staff had staffed for. The merchandise tables stocked with standard Indian Wells gear were supplemented almost immediately by an informal economy of handmade signs, national flags purchased from shops across the Southland, and shirts that someone had printed somewhere, bearing Eala's name and face. The practice courts were packed in a way that practice courts at Indian Wells simply are not. Dozens of people, hundreds at peak times, waiting and watching a player warm up in the way that fans at a pop concert wait outside a sound check, hoping for proximity to something that feels historic. And the chanting, that is what the longtime staff kept coming back to. The chanting and the drums and the sustained noise that replaced the traditional murmur of a tournament that had, for most of its existence, prided itself on a certain kind of composed, appreciative quiet. Indian Wells had never heard that sound before, and now it has. For anyone coming to this story without full context, here is what you need to know about Alexandra Eala. She is 20 years old, she is left-handed. She was born in Quezon City in the Philippines, a sprawling metropolis of millions, a city that produces fighters in every sense of the word. She started playing tennis young, showed talent early, and made a decision, or rather her family made a decision, that is worth pausing on for a moment. They sent her to the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Spain, at 13 years old. Think about what that means in practice. A 13-year-old girl from the Philippines traveling to the opposite end of the world to train in a system built on one of the most demanding athletic philosophies in the history of professional sports. The Nadal Academy is not a gentle introduction to professional tennis. It is modeled on the principles that produced a player who has won 14 French Opens. The idea that you earn everything, that the work is the point, that suffering in practice is the price of competing at the top level of the sport. She stayed, she worked, she developed. In 2022, she won the US Open Girls Singles title, the first Filipino player in history to win a junior Grand Slam singles title in any category. That victory was celebrated in the Philippines with the kind of national enthusiasm that the country reserves for its most significant sporting achievements. She was on the front pages. She was on national television. She was at 17 already carrying something that most professional athletes never encounter at any age. The transition from junior tennis to the professional tour is where most prodigies stumble. The gap between juniors and the WTA is not a step, it's a leap, sometimes more of a cliff. Junior Grand Slam champions who become top 10 professionals are a small minority. The overwhelming majority of junior stars fade against the physical, tactical, and psychological demands of the professional circuit. Eala did not fade. She worked. She climbed through the ITF circuit, the lower tier events that take place in cities most tennis fans have never heard of, before crowds of dozens rather than thousands, in conditions that test a player's genuine love for the sport. Every point in those tournaments was a point toward the ranking she needed. Every win was a brick in the wall. She finished 2025 ranked 50th in the world. She did it by beating Grand Slam champions, by reaching the semi-finals of a WTA 1000 event as a qualifier, by fighting her way through third sets that most players would have let go. She did it the way her academy trained her to do everything, by refusing to stop. And now she is at Indian Wells, at the 5th Grand Slam, and the 5th Grand Slam has never felt like this. Let's talk about what she actually does on a tennis court, because the cultural story is real and is significant, but it exists alongside a genuinely exceptional athletic talent, and that talent deserves its own careful examination. Eala is left-handed, which immediately places her in a category that gives any right-handed opponent a particular kind of problem. Left-handedness in tennis is not simply a mirroring of the right-handed game. The serve tails in different directions, the angles available from the ad court are different. Patterns that work against right-handed opponents have to be entirely rebuilt against lefties. And Eala has spent years in a training environment that taught her to maximize every advantage her left-handedness creates. Her serve to the backhand side of a right-handed opponent, the natural curling motion created by her lefty delivery, is a weapon she has refined to a high level. She doesn't rely on raw pace, she uses placement and movement to set up the next ball, which is where the real architecture of her game begins to reveal itself. On the forehand side, the influence of her academy is legible in every swing. Heavy topspin, generated by the kind of long looping swing path that the Nadal system teaches and refines over years of repetition. The ball arrives at her opponent's contact point with a high bounce and a violent kick that pushes players behind the baseline and disrupts their timing. Against players who prefer the ball low and fast, and many of the tour's top players fit that description, this is a genuine disruption. The backhand tells a different story. It is flatter, more direct, a two-handed stroke that she can unload with surprising pace, particularly on the down-the-line ball that she uses to redirect when opponents overload her forehand corner. The contrast between the heavy spinning forehand and the flat punishing backhand is tactically significant. It makes her difficult to pattern against, difficult to develop a reliable game plan for. Indian Wells suits her. The courts here play slower than most hard-court venues. The altitude is low, the desert air is dry, and the ball sits up in the hitting zone in ways that favor high-bouncing topspin. The conditions that make some players feel like they're pushing through sand tend to give heavy baseliners more time and more room. For Eala, this tournament is close to ideal in terms of surface characteristics. And the mental component, the question of whether she can function under the specific kind of pressure that exists when thousands of people have crossed state lines specifically to watch you perform, that question has an answer too. She has been under pressure of this kind since she was 14 years old. The Philippines does not do understated national investment in its athletic heroes. Every match she played as a junior was covered, analyzed, celebrated, or dissected by national media. She has been the subject of expectations she didn't ask for and cannot put down for years. What that does, if you're built correctly and trained well, is it strips away the novelty of pressure. It makes the noise normal. It makes the expectation something to use rather than something to survive. The crowd in Indian Wells is not a burden for her. You can watch her face when the stadium erupts and understand that immediately. It is fuel. Here is the part of the story that the tournament directors and television executives and tour administrators are paying very close attention to, because it has implications that extend well beyond one player and one tournament. Tennis has spent years and considerable resources trying to grow beyond its traditional geographic footprint. The sport has deep roots in Europe, strong foundations in the United States and Australia, and an increasingly solid base in East Asia. China and Japan have both produced Grand Slam champions and host major events. But Southeast Asia has remained largely theoretical on the sport's expansion map. The populations are enormous. The sporting appetite is enormous. The infrastructure and the visibility required to convert that appetite into tennis participation simply haven't been there. What Eala represents to the sport's commercial and developmental infrastructure is something that no marketing campaign could manufacture: organic, genuine, bottom-up demand. She did not happen because the WTA ran an outreach campaign in the Philippines. She happened because she was talented and she worked and she persisted. And when she started winning at the level where people pay attention, the connection between her achievement and 100 million people's sense of possibility was immediate and electric. Coco Gauff, who defeated Eala in Dubai earlier this season, said something after that match that has stayed in the conversation. Standing on court after a 6-0, 6-2 win, she addressed what Eala means for the broader sport. "I'd like to thank Alex for bringing a new demographic to the sport. I really appreciate it. I think it's great." That is the reigning US Open champion, on court in the immediate aftermath of a victory, choosing to spend part of her winner's interview talking about what her defeated opponent is contributing to the game they share. That is not a small thing. That is recognition of something real. Jessica Pegula, one of the most experienced voices on the tour, has been equally clear. The way she's been able to pack stadiums and the way her country supports her is something special. She handles it so maturely, with such grace. The people who share courts with her, who watch from close range, who understand the sport in its full technical and competitive complexity, they see what is happening. They recognize it. They are not confused about whether this is manufacturer enthusiasm or something that goes deeper. For tournament organizers, what is happening at Indian Wells this week is a data point that will be referenced in planning conversations for years. The economic impact of thousands of fans descending on a tournament ticket revenue, concessions, merchandise, hotel nights in the Coachella Valley, meals at local restaurants is measurable and significant. But the global visibility, the content that is being created organically by fans, the images that are moving across platforms showing a California tennis venue turned into a sea of Philippine flags, that is the kind of reach that no promotional budget produces. The WTA's global expansion strategy just received a real-world proof of concept. Pull back even further from the immediate economics of this particular week and something longer-term comes into view. Tennis is expensive. That fact shapes the sports development pipeline in ways that are often invisible to fans who follow it casually. Court time costs money, coaching at a serious level costs money, equipment costs money, travel to tournaments, even the lower tier events where young players build their rankings cost money. In countries where per capita income makes these expenses prohibitive, the talent pipeline simply doesn't develop, regardless of how much raw athletic potential exists in the population. Visibility is the force that begins to change this. When a young girl in Manila or Cebu or Davao watches footage of Alexandra Eala walking into a stadium court in California to a wall of sound from thousands of people waving the same flag she sees every morning in her classroom, something shifts. The dream becomes concrete. It has a face. It has a technique that can be studied. It has a path that can be traced, even if the path is extraordinarily difficult. What follows visibility? When the visibility is this significant, is investment. Not always immediately, not always sufficiently, but the pressure to build public courts, to fund development programs, to identify and support young talent before it disappears to more accessible sports. That pressure grows when the sport produces someone like Eala. The private sector follows too. Brands that want to be associated with the movement, academies that want to draw from the talent pool, equipment companies looking at market expansion, they all recalibrate when a market of 100 million people suddenly has a reason to pay attention. This is what one player, at one tournament, in one remarkable week, sets in motion. There is one more dimension to this, that the sports and economics analysis doesn't fully capture, and it might be the most important one. Look at the faces in those stands. The families who drove up from Los Angeles on Thursday night so they could be in line when the gates opened Friday morning. The grandparents in Filipino national team jerseys. The kids holding handmade signs in language their American-born parents maybe don't speak as fluently as their grandparents do. The young women who see Eala and see something specific, not just an athlete, but a particular kind of proof. Immigration is at its core an act of belief. You leave what you know because you believe that what your family can build somewhere new is worth the cost of the leaving. The Filipino-American community in Southern California is, in many cases, 2 and 3 generations into that act of faith. They have built lives here, they have contributed to cities and industries and neighborhoods across the region, and they have maintained, in the way that diaspora communities always do, a deep and complex relationship with the country they or their parents or grandparents came from. Alexandra Eala, at 20 years old, on a tennis court in the California desert, has given that community something to gather around. Not just to celebrate, but to be together, to be collectively, visibly, undeniably present. To say, in the language of flags and chanting and sheer numbers, that they are here, that they are part of this, that the success happening on that court belongs to them in some real and meaningful way. That is what is happening at Indian Wells this week. It is happening in the middle of a tennis tournament. It is being transmitted to the world through the cameras of a global sports broadcast, and its significance extends in every direction, into the sport, into the culture, into the living rooms of young athletes in a country 7,000 miles away who are watching and beginning to believe. Let's be clear-eyed about one thing, because clarity serves Eala better than uncritical adoration. She is 20 years old and ranked 50th in the world. The players in the upper reaches of this draw are better than her right now. The players she will need to beat to win Indian Wells have been at the top of the sport for years, have experience she hasn't yet accumulated, and will not be moved by the crowd in the way that a casual observer might hope. After her loss to Gauff in Dubai, Eala herself was direct about this. "I still have a long way to go to be at the level of the best women's tennis players. I have to be honest about that." That honesty, that refusal to be protected from the truth by the size of her support, is one of the things that makes her worth believing in for the long term. She is not constructing a myth about herself. She is building a career point by point, tournament by tournament, with a clear-eyed understanding of the distance still to travel. The victory at Indian Wells this week may not appear in the draw results. It may not end with a trophy or a winner's check, but something has already been won. The tennis world has been shown in the most concrete and measurable terms possible that the audience for this sport is larger than it knew, that the markets it considered peripheral are capable of passion that its traditional centers rarely match, and that the player who made all of this happen did so not by being handed anything, but by working for years in conditions far from home until she was ready to command a stage this large. Before you go, we want something from you, and we mean this genuinely. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Not because it's a nice YouTube thing to do, though it is, but because we actually want to know. Because part of what is extraordinary about this moment is its geography. The people in those stands drove in from cities across Southern California. The people watching on their phones are spread across the Philippines and beyond. The people debating this on social media are on 6 continents. This is what Eala has done. She has made this sports conversation global in a way that press releases and market expansion strategies cannot manufacture. So tell us where you are. Tell us whether you think she makes a deep run here. Tell us what this moment means to you if you're part of the community that drove through the night to be in those stands. Subscribe if you haven't, ring the bell. There is more tennis ahead, and this story is nowhere near its end. The woman who turned Indian Wells into a home game 7,000 miles from home is just getting started.